Hi, everybody. This is Marlene with Eerie News, and today is November 30th, 2024. Saturday, November 30th, 2024. Here we are, 30 days out from 2025. How time flies when you're having fun. Like listening to Eerie News. But anyway, let's go on to our first story. It's out of Stranger Than Fiction Stories, and it's titled The Lost Padre. It was a foggy night on August 2nd, 1921, when Father Patrick Haslan disappeared. He had now returned from a late night plea for last rites, and the fear was that he had driven off Highway 1 and plunged into the ocean below. It all started at 9 p.m. when a knock sounded out on the parish door of Holy Angels Church in Colma, California. The housekeeper opened the door to a man dressed in a heavy overcoat with a collar pulled up to obscure his face. He also wore motorist goggles and a hat with a visor, which further impeded sight of his face. He told her that he came on behalf of a dying friend that needed last rites. The priest jumped in the car and they drove off. Later witnesses' statements were contradictory as to the description of the man. On the morning of August 3rd, Father Haslan had not returned. However, his housekeeper imagined the dying man was lingering on his deathbed. 2 days later, a posse of Colma citizens searched the roadsides and gulches in the area, hoping to find his body. Mary Wendell, the housekeeper, said the heavily muffled man appeared to be a foreigner, who walked back and forth as if deeply anxious. The only other fact that was known was that the stranger drove a Ford Auto. Word went out to find if there was a sick man who had sent for a priest, but none could be found. Parishioners from Holy Angels Church joined in the hunt by driving the road surrounding Colma. There were three spots that initially were investigated. They were an abandoned rock quarry on the side of Pedro Mountain, Carroll Lake, an isolated body of water, and a deserted adobe relic on the Portola expedition dating back to 1770. This stood in a lonely canyon 3 miles from Salada Beach and a mile from the highway. 3 days after Father Halson was taken, a typewritten ransom note was sent to Archbishop Edward J. Hanna. The demand was for $6,500 for the priest's safe return. Since it was received before the disappearance of Father Haslan became publicly known, it was believed not to be a hoax. At the bottom of the note, the ransomer had written in his own hand, quote, "Had to hit him 4 times, and he is unconscious from pressure on brain, so better hurry and no fooling," end quote. Two handwriting experts concluded the writer was deranged and possibly harbored anti-Catholic sentiment. Even after receiving the ransom note, many did not believe any harm would come to Father Haslan. Others, though, suspected the worst. Airplanes, bloodhounds, sheriffs, mounted police, and parties from the Knights of Columbus engaged in the search, not only along the roadways but in the surrounding hills. Others watched the surf in case his body washed ashore. There was debate as to whether the action was directed at Father Haslan or against the Catholic Church. After receipt of the ransom note, it was found the automobile of Holy Angels Parish, which Father Haslan often drove, was missing from the garage at the rear of the parish house. The fence was broken and tracks on the lawn showed it was turned south towards San Francisco. It also came to light that on the day before his disappearance, Father Haslan hinted at trouble when he was lunching with Thomas McCoy, a friend. He said that he was very unhappy in regard to Colma conditions and wished he were back at Turlock. Strangely, the newspapers referred to the little town of Colma as, quote, "home of prize fights and eccentric characters," end quote. This description would prove to be quite prophetic 8 days later. A reporter from the San Francisco Examiner stood outside the offices of Archbishop Hanna, hoping to get a scoop about the missing priest, when he was approached by a man named William A. Hightower. The strange man said that he too had come to see the Archbishop with important information about the disappearance of Father Haslan. At this time, the church had offered an $11,000 reward for information about the crime. Hightower said Dolly Mason, quote, "a woman who he knew in Salt Lake City, who told me she met a foreigner under the influence of liquor who said he was the slayer of the priest," end quote. To add to the strange story, he said the grave was being guarded by a man flipping pancakes. Hightower then changed the story and stated a different woman told him it was bootleg liquor buried on the beach, but he had not dug in the sand to see if either a body or illegal hooch was buried there, but instead marked the spot with a scarf. The reporter asked Police Chief Daniel O'Brien to come with him to the beach, accompanied by Hightower. Surprisingly, they found a billboard for pancake flour, depicting a man making flapjacks. Three other newspapermen joined the group who dug by lantern into the sandy beach. Hightower started to dig, and when cautioned by the police, he said, "Don't worry, I'm digging at the feet." He was right, because what emerged from the sand was a human arm. The search for Father Haslam was over. A stretcher was lowered by ropes more than 100 feet to the bottom of the cliff in order to recover the body. The officials found that no automobile could have been driven to the edge of the cliff, and it was believed he had been asked to walk over the sand dunes to the cliff and had been shot at that point, or after he fell, the murderer found him at the bottom and shot him there. His injured skull was believed to have occurred due to the fall. Chief O'Brien said Hightower had no problem finding the grave, and that he admitted to working on the Ocean Shore Railway when it was being constructed, and thus was familiar with the area. Hightower was rather surprised when the police arrested him for the murder, since he thought he had done a good thing by bringing the authorities to the location of the body. An autopsy found that Father Haslam had been shot twice, but only after receiving massive injuries to his skull, and his brain had been crushed by the force of the blows. He was shot in the heart and the head. Father Haslam had $80 in his pocket, proof that robbery was not a motive in the crime. The final cause of death was the injury to his skull, and the doctor believed he was shot after he was dead. The newspaper described Hightower's mental state as unstable. He says he's a prohibitionist. He insists the world is going to the devil because of machinery supplanting man in industry. He says he is the author of religious tracts. After his apprehension, Hightower said he thought the murderer would kill Dolly Mason, a prostitute, for giving him the clue of what was buried on the beach. She was traced to Santa Rosa, and a review of the city records found a woman with that name was arrested there in 1916 on a charge of plying men with liquor and then robbing them. However, this was the mother of the young Dolly Mason who was implicated in the crime by Hightower. Another connection was made to Doris Shirley, a woman who Hightower said he had been living with until the prior week. Police found her trunk, which had been sent from the Hotel Marymount as a shipment to Santa Rosa. Hightower's story of his earlier life was verified. The small bakery he owned in Clovis was still doing business under a different owner. He got married in 1910 to Ethel Bowers. The records show he was from Texas and his wife from Oklahoma. Hightower was well liked by his neighbors. However, he did not have a good marriage, and his wife left Clovis sometime in 1913. In 1921, she returned to Oklahoma and died exactly 1 month before Father Haslam's kidnapping. This is an instance of where forensic geology was used over 100 years ago. Quote, in a remarkable bit of genius or luck, UC Berkeley chemistry professor Edward Heinrich examined handwriting on the note and announced to the police that the writer had the hand of a baker and decorator of cakes. Thus, when William Hightower reported to the police that he had heard where the body of Father Haslam was buried, they were immediately suspicious that he might know more than he admitted. Hightower was a master baker. Heinrich examined the place on the California beach where Hightower indicated the body of Father Haslam would be found. The body was found, and the investigation also produced a number of objects of physical evidence, such as boards from a tent floor. Heinrich studied grains of sand recovered from Hightower's knife and pronounced them similar to the sand on the beach where the body was found. In Hightower's room, a tent was found, and the tent contained an abundance of sand, which, when studied, confirmed the results from the knife. It appeared that Hightower had kidnapped and murdered Father Haslam and kept his body in the tent on the beach for several days before burying it in the sand. Having done these things, he then reported to the police having received information about the location of the body. End quote. Written before the discovery of Father Haslam's body, a new letter was received by Archbishop Edward Hanna, in which $15,000 was demanded for the safe return of the priest, It read, quote, Archbishop Hannah, don't be surprised to get this. It is to tell you Father Heslin is not dead. Neither is he injured, yet. Fate has made me do this. Sickness and misery have compelled my action. I must have money. Please forgive this act if you can. Have $15,000 cash ready. You will hear from me very soon. The manner in which this is to be paid will be revealed to you in my own way very soon. In fact, now that the excitement has died down, Father Heslin is brave and says for you to help him. Have money ready for my future instructions. You will hear from me very soon. You will know I am the right person as I will have the piece of paper that fits in this letter. End quote. Another letter was received directing police to the Grand Southern Hotel at 1095 Mission Street. The intent of the letter, though, was to make sure Hightower was implicated in the crime. In the room, police found what they called an infernal machine, which consisted of 10 shells loaded with shot and embedded in plaster of Paris. It turns out Hightower was registered there, and he later admitted he had taken the contrivance to a point on the San Pedro Road a mile above Colma, to the spot to which the ransom was to be dropped off. He then decided to bring it back to his room. Even though a rifle and a number of cartridges were found in Hightower's room, along with newspaper clippings about the reward, the cartridges did not match the ones found at the shallow grave. Prior to his stay at the Grand Southern Hotel, Hightower had stayed with a young woman at the Larne Hotel on July 23rd. Then on July 31st, he registered with a woman at the Hotel Senate. A comparison of the signatures from both hotels matched. When he came to the Grand Southern Hotel, he was alone. Police also discovered that Hightower had rented a Ford Auto and picked it up from the garage on the day of Father Heslin's abduction. Inside the room was a typewriter he had rented, which matched the ransom note. Another letter written before the discovery on the beach was a baffling black hand letter sent to Constable Landini of Colma, saying the priest was done for and advising the constable to lay off. The letter was printed in ink and bore a number of peculiar marks. It was slipped under the door at the Archbishop's residence. Later, another black hand letter was received by Constable Landini, which said, Don't try to get Heslin any more. He is done for. This is how we did it. There was a picture of a knife dripping with blood. In the meantime, Hightower would respond with the word Ishkabibble when asked a question he did not like. Instead of worrying about a murder charge hanging over his head, Hightower spent his time writing poetry in his jail cell. 2 months after the disappearance of Father Heslin, Hightower was brought to trial in Redwood City. During the proceedings, the housekeeper identified Hightower as the man who came to the rectory seeking a priest to accompany him. An acquaintance of Hightower told authorities he had expressed his hatred for the Catholic Church. On October 14th, the jury gave a guilty verdict after deliberating for 2 hours. His fate was life in prison, to be served at San Quentin. Behind bars, Hightower continued with his odd behavior. A baker by trade, he poured his efforts into baking goods and became the prison's top chef. He also helped create a dietary guideline for the prison. Between his baking bouts, he wrote a weekly newsletter titled Observations from A. Hightower. Over the course of his life, he produced 15,000 of them that were filled with jingles, aphorisms, and epigrams. Hightower was released on parole on March 29, 1965, when he was 87 years old. He had been denied parole 26 times before. He told the prison guards he had a friend coming to pick him up. However, no one ever came. He died in 1974 at the age of 95. Heslin's history. Father Heslin's family immigrated from Ireland excuse me, and settled in San Francisco. He had a cousin who was a monk in St. Elizabeth's Franciscan Monastery in Oakland. His brother was Bishop Thomas Heslin of Natchez, Mississippi, who had passed away in 1911. He had first served at Sacred Heart Church before leaving St. Columba. Then he went to Turlock, where he was pastor. Then a month before the abduction, he was promoted by the Archbishop to pastor of the larger parish at Colma on the outskirts of San Francisco. A disturbing incident regarding Heslin occurred on May 1904. Agnes Pereira, an 11-year-old, accused Father Heslin of a serious offense, which was a euphemism for some type of molestation. The girl, along with her parents, made a sworn affidavit with the prosecuting attorney. The priest was released on a $5,000 bond after being arrested. He denied the allegations and said it was done for spite. A month later, the case was dismissed based on the grounds, quote, that the complaint did not state sufficient facts to justify a cause of action, end quote. Hightower, with his erratic behavior, was easily identified as Father Heslin's killer. But what could have been the motive, or had there been someone else involved in the act? Was there a mastermind accomplice who held a grudge against the priest who had served his parishes since 1887? Or was it, as some thought, that the church was the target? Most disturbing would be the thought this person walked away free. According to Steve Hodel, an author of several books on his father, Dr. George Hodel, the mastermind behind Heslin's murder was none other than his father. There was a newspaper article referring to number 13 and how it played into bad luck for Hightower. The significance to Hodel is that he was 13 years old when the crime was committed. Steve Hodel had also tied his father to the Zodiac killer who operated in Northern California during the late 1960s. This perpetrator also used the number 13, which he placed under a cross on the letters and ciphers he sent law enforcement from 1969 to 1974. Was the cross a reference to the murder of Father Heslin? The drawing of the bleeding knife was a crime signature used by George Hodel, which he sent to the press. He used it as the Black Dahlia Avenger and as Zodiac. Steve Hodel believes his father drew inspiration for this depiction from a crude drawing sent by Jack the Ripper to police in 1886. Steve Hodel believes this was his father's first murder. He was young then, but he had a very high IQ and graduating from high school when he was 15 years old. City of the Dead. Around 1900, a 2-mile area south of San Francisco's Mission District, which was then known as Cow Hollow, was eventually eyed as the place to bury the overflowing dead from San Francisco. Ironically, the small town of Colma has always been known as a City of the Dead due to the vast amount of cemeteries located there. The last count was 17 with about 2 million burials. The discovery of gold in 1849 inflated the population. Then bubonic plague broke out in San Francisco in 1900. An earthquake caused extensive damage and death in 1906. Soon after the earthquake, the city caught fire. 12 years later, the Spanish flu struck San Francisco. Around 1924, the city had fewer than 1,000 residents, most of who worked in the funeral industry. It was in Holy Cross Catholic Cemetery that Father Heslin was laid to rest. The first letter received after the abduction read, and if you want to, this is a long letter. You can go to Stranger Than Fiction Stories at Miami Ghost Chronicles and you can read it. All right, and it's very interesting. And below it is a picture of the handwritten part of it. And there's because remember there were several that were received. Most of them were on that typewriter, and then others were handwritten. Now, there's a footnote here regarding this case. 3 months after the murder of Father Heslin, another priest was murdered in Lead, South Dakota. His name was Father Arthur Belknap, and he was also lured to his death by a plea for last rites. A man came to the residence of Bishop J.J. Fowler at about 3 a.m. on a sick call for a woman. The priest went to the garage for his auto, but it failed to start, so he set out on foot with the man. A short time later, residents who lived in the area of Poor Man Gulch Road heard 3 shots. A few minutes later, the father was found dead. One of the bullets had entered his head. The police started to doubt the motive for the crime was robbery. Soon after the murder, Andrew Rolando was the prime suspect. He had come to Lead to work at the Homestake mine. The young Sicilian had disappeared right after the murder, and by the end of the year, a reward was being offered for his apprehension. A year later, he was traced as far as Nemo, South Dakota. Rolando was known to be manic in his hatred of anything connected with the Catholic Church and priests. Then in 1923, Father John Vraniak from Illinois mysteriously disappeared. Authorities looked to Rolando as a suspect since among his papers he made mention of knowing a girl who lived there, and that he had visited the town a number of times. Nothing else happened in the case until 1932, when a priest in Ontario, Canada, confessed to killing Belknap. Theodore Paul Hucal also confessed that he had paid Andrew Rolando $500 to get suspicion to fall on him. He said he had killed Belknap for, quote, personal reasons. However, records did not coincide with Hucal's time in Lead, since he didn't arrive till after the murder. He stayed there a short time and left the priesthood soon after. He went to Denver and married. Prior to his arrival in Lead, he had been a patient for a year for the feeble-minded maintained by the church at St. Benoit, Canada. He was released after being deemed cured. Hucal said in total he had paid Rolando about $1,900 to take the blame, and he believed the fugitive had fled to Argentina or Brazil. The authorities in Lead discounted his confession because of the discrepancy in dates, and the Canadian police believed he was attempting to escape a forgery sentence. Rolando was never apprehended, and the trail on him was lost somewhere in Wyoming. Father John Vraniak was never found. So here in a short amount of time, you have three priests. Well, one was disappeared, but you're going to assume that he was killed because they never found him. Two of them were lured away with this, we have a sick person, last rites. Like, come with me right away. And it even makes you wonder with Belknap that all of a sudden his car's not working, if it was tampered with, so that he would just leave on foot. And it's almost like they almost know that the priests are going to go because this is a person, on their deathbed. And as to Father Heslin, it makes you think for sure there was an accomplice, because it almost seems like this guy Hightower was eccentric, is a nice word for it, peculiar. And somebody sent a letter to the police telling them go to this hotel. And sure enough, they found all this evidence, the typewriter, the tent. It's almost like somebody said, this guy's odd. He's the right person. And he's kind of disjointed in what he says. And I'll do this and I'll let him, this crazy guy, take the fall for it. That's what it sounds like to me. Like this was a little bit too complicated in that letter sending the police to the room where he was at. And if Steve Hodel is correct, and his father, which he has written various books on this, which he claims his father was the man who killed the Black Dahlia, and as a matter of fact several other gruesome murders, then considering he was only 13 years old, but at the same time he was very, very intelligent. And if you ever go into his to some of the explanations, some of the research he's done, it's very convincing of what he proposes, that his father was a super intelligent psychopath, a violent psychopath. But yeah, very interesting. And so, but technically, even though Hightower went to jail for it, I have a feeling that there was someone else involved in that. Okay, next story. This is also out of Stranger Than Fiction Stories. And this is titled Cannabis and the Brain. Doctors are mystified when they have patients complaining of nausea and vomiting more than 20 times in one day and dropping weight to a life-threatening level. This is a condition that they are seeing more frequently in chronic heavy pot users. Desiree Haight, 46, came to the hospital after vomiting more than 30 times per day. She was hospitalized for months and was fed with a tube. She had dropped to less than 100 pounds. She was a long-time pot smoker when she started to experience abdominal cramps, nausea, and vomiting that left her incapacitated. Initially, the doctors were mystified and then thought it was psychosomatic. 13 years passed where she had a reoccurrence of these symptoms, and in 2018, a doctor asked her the right question. Was she taking hot showers to relieve her symptoms? The answer was yes, which dovetailed with findings of physicians in both Canada and the United States that these symptoms are more prevalent with the increased legalization of recreational marijuana. The hot showers actually dehydrates the person more, making them sicker and possibly leading to a type of renal failure. It causes frequent visits to the emergency department, according to Dr. Timothy Myers, Medical Director of Emergency Services for Boulder Community Health. People feel terrible when it happens. Physicians don't totally understand the mechanism that produces these symptoms, but suspect ease of availability and stronger strains can be contributing factors. It is a very unique clinical syndrome that is characterized by a number of unique presentations, Dr. Eddie Lang said, adding that one of them is a distinctive guttural sound, not apparent in other types of vomiting. Identifying the source of what is making the patient feel so sick is half the battle, as doctors find that these patients are resistant to their instruction, which is to stop smoking pot for an indefinite period of time. Cases of cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome, or CHS, have doubled since 2017. In a worst case scenario, it causes extreme dehydration, seizure, and kidney failure. In June 2024, a study described where a 22-year-old woman died from heart problems, which doctors blamed on CHS due to 8 years of regular cannabis use. Prior to her death, she had been to the doctor 6 times, presenting with the symptoms of CHS. According to Dr. Maria Isabel Angulo with the University of Illinois, CHS affects an estimated 2.75 million Americans each year. Men between the ages of 16 and 34 has seen the most increase. She attributes this to the potency of THC and marijuana currently on the market and availability due to the legalization. CHS is typically divided into 3 phases. Prodromal phase, marked by waves of nausea in the morning and abdominal discomfort, but no vomiting. The phase may last for months or even years. Hypermetic phase, marked by intense and persistent nausea, vomiting, abdominal pain, dehydration, and weight loss. Recovery phase. After abstaining from cannabis, symptoms typically improve within days and resolve within weeks. Recent research has found that genetic factors contribute to CHS. These genes affect dopamine activity, pain responses, mood regulation, and gut disturbances. The genes are the following: COMT gene, TRPV1 gene, CYP2C9 gene, DRD2 gene, and ABCA1 gene. These findings indicate there is a complex genetic basis for CHS. Quote, plenty of regular long-term and high-potency users of cannabis do not report CHS symptoms. However, it may take years for CHS to develop. Most cases of CHS have been shown to occur in people who consume cannabis roughly 20 days per month, and about 75% of those patients have used cannabis regularly for more than a year. More than 70% of CHS sufferers are men. End quote. Cannabis use in schizophrenia. A new scientific study has linked smoking cannabis with certain psychiatric conditions, such as schizophrenia. It found that people with schizophrenia are also more likely to use cannabis. The researchers used an analysis technique called Mendelian randomization. The study identified 35 different genes associated with cannabis use, with the strongest association in a gene called CADM2, which is associated with risky behavior, personality, and alcohol use, said Professor Jacqueline Vink, the study's lead author. One of the largest correlations was the genetic overlap between cannabis use and the risk of schizophrenia. People with schizophrenia use cannabis as a form of self-medication. However, there might be a reverse cause and effect relationship in which cannabis use could contribute to the risk of schizophrenia. Also found was a genetic overlap between cannabis use and the use of tobacco and alcohol. Personality types that are prone to more risky behavior or were more extroverted also had a similar overlap for the use of cannabis. Quote, a convergence of evidence shows the use of cannabis sativa is associated with increased risk of developing psychotic disorders, including schizophrenia and early age at which psychotic symptoms first manifest. Cannabis exposure during adolescence is most strongly associated with the onset of psychosis among those who are particularly vulnerable, such as those who have been exposed to child abuse and those with family histories of schizophrenia. End quote. Schizophrenia is a brain disease that affects approximately 1% of the population. Symptoms are, quote, delusions, hallucinations, disorganized thinking, social withdrawal, amotivation, affective flattening, deficit memories, deficit memory, executive functioning, processing speed, and a decline in social and occupational functioning, end quote. In 1987, it was reported that heavy cannabis use was associated with a six-fold increase in risk for schizophrenia based on a 15-year follow-up of Swedish military conscripts. Another study found that patients with schizophrenia who use cannabis versus those that don't have a higher rate of psychosis in their family histories. Two large longitudinal studies confirm that a history of childhood maltreatment and cannabis use prior to a diagnosis of schizophrenia are associated with a higher risk of psychosis. In an urban environment is associated with psychosis and cannabis use. It has also been found that those who develop schizophrenia after cannabis use tend to have more severe psychotic symptoms. Quote, the evidence for an association between cannabis use and schizophrenia is compelling, as is the evidence that THC and synthetic cannabinoids can provoke symptoms of schizophrenia in healthy subjects and exacerbate symptoms in patients with schizophrenia. THC has multiple actions that could disrupt brain development in vulnerable adolescents, including impairment of neuroplasticity, dysregulation of dopamine and glutamate signaling, and possibly neurotoxicity. End quote. The reason why I found this interesting is precisely because of that. Of and I had heard this before. I mean, not only is it easier because whether it's prior to this medical marijuana and now legalization in small doses, in small amounts, and in other words, that there's this thing where there's some people are in the camp of you know trying to remove criminality from people that occasionally smoke pot. But then you see this the flip side of it is, which is overuse, and look what's happening. People die, um, and it exacerbates schizophrenia or psychosis or causes it. And of course, there's always a family history. Genetics always plays a part. So it's like in a perfect world, if it was legalized, people would use it in a responsible manner, just like alcohol. But unfortunately, like everything else, just you know, some type of either genetic predisposition or even what they're saying self-medication, it's they do it too much, and renal failure ends in what it describes as it will take you to the brink of death if not kill you, especially if you're comorbid with any other type of disease. And I thought this was very interesting because this is something that now we face, in modern history. And you could argue, well, even if pot is not legalized, if somebody really wants to buy it, they're going to buy it. But still, again, and one of the most important things, which is the potency, the TH, the marijuana that's being, the cannabis that's being, I guess, grown now, apparently is much more potent than what was around maybe 30, 40, 50 years ago. Another whole problem. So yeah, there we go. Something, it is what it is, one of our modern day problems. And, the last thing we need is more psychotic people running around because they do awful things. Anyway, let's go on to another story. This is out of LAD Bible. And this is titled, Experts Finally Solve Mystery of Strange Skeleton with Bones from 5 People Who Lived 2,500 Years Apart. Archaeologists believe they finally cracked the baffling puzzle which involves a skeleton made up of bones from 5 different people who lived 2,500 years apart. Stumbling upon a gravesite from the ancient world isn't anything particularly new, and at first it seemed like the site in the town of Poma-Serul, southern Belgium, was no different. However, the site would soon reveal a bizarre archaeological anomaly after radiocarbon dating of a skeleton revealed it featured bones from 5 different individuals. So how the hell did this happen? The skeleton was discovered back in the 1970s and assumed to be from the Roman era, around 2nd or 3rd century AD. This was also backed up by the discovery of a bone pin recovered near the skull, which is common for the time. However, the fetal position which the skeleton was found in intrigued experts, as this was uncommon for burials of the time. Fast forward to 2019, and the remains were sent for radiocarbon dating, which revealed the skull was in fact from the Roman era and belonged to a woman who lived sometime in the period of AD 69 to 210. However, the same couldn't be said for the rest of the body. Other bones found in the grave dated back to the Stone Age period, suggesting the skull had been added at a later date by people in the Roman era. Speaking about how researchers believe the skeleton came to be, Barbara Veselka, archaeologist at Vrije University, Brussels, and study led, explained it was likely the burial was made at once and was later revisited by others. There were other bones scattered around the individual, suggesting that people could also have come back to the burial, she explained. As to why aspect of the burial, as, as for the why aspect of the burial, researchers believe superstition could have played a part in assembling the skeleton. Disturbance of the burial may have necessitated reparations through the completion or construction of an individual with agency in the afterlife. A second possibility is that the entire individual was assembled during the Gallo-Roman period, combining locally sourced Neolithic bones with a Roman period cranium. So a group of superstitious Romans stumbled upon the site and uncovered the incomplete skeleton, and then decided to complete the body with a skull of a more recently deceased person. The exact reasoning is unclear. However, the study concludes the burial was clearly intentional. The bones are selected, a fitting location chosen, and the elements arranged carefully to mimic the correct anatomical order, the study adds. The resulting burial implies great care and planning as well as a good knowledge of human anatomy. And I thought that was interesting. But what I think is more interesting is apparently this skeleton that was placed in the fetal position that belonged to a Neolithic person was missing a head. All right? So they decided to take this woman's head and put it on this skeleton, which, by the way, they don't specify if the bones that were in there were male or female. All right? And I wish I understood what, or they ever explored what was the superstition that would say, wow, we found the skeleton. Oh, it's missing a head. Quick, get one for it. And what was the fear? And I know that there was a lot of superstitions and things, But then again, I thought that was really unusual. So anyway, here we are. And then for our last story, this is out of Stranger Than Fiction stories, we have one titled Doorway to Demonic Possession. In 1990, there was a Gallup poll that showed that percentage of Americans who believed the devil is real was 55%. In 2007, it had increased to 70%. It's estimated that at least 50% believe in demonic possession. The belief in demons as foes of mankind stretches back to ancient times and across different cultures. In recent times, a belief in demons and exorcisms are thought to be the province of the Catholic Church. In 2018, Father Vincent Lampert, the official exorcist for the Archdiocese of Indianapolis, disclosed he received approximately 1,700 phone calls or email requesting exorcisms. Other priests describe where they get enough inquiries about demonic possessions that without the support of staff, they would be working entirely on exorcisms. The demand for exorcists has driven up the number of priests that are tapped for this special position. In 2011, the U.S. had fewer than 15. Present day, it's estimated there are over 100. The number is difficult to verify since the church conceals their identity. In 2017, the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, or the USCCB, created the first ever English translation of the Roman Catholic Church's Latin rituals for exorcism, making it easier for a bishop exorcist to find a priest who could assist him, since even among the clergy there's a lack of facility with Latin. Hold on. The question is, why now? After the advances of science and technology have deemed these claims of spiritual interference as superstition. In 1921, a German psychologist named Traugott Osterreich collected historical eyewitness accounts in his book Possession, Demonical and Other. One story is about a peasant girl named Magdalene who lived in Orlach, Germany. In the winter of 1831, she started to see weird things in the barn while she tended the cows. The following years, she heard voices and felt she was being physically assaulted. Others around her witnessed moments of spontaneous bursts of flames. During the summer, Magdalene said a spirit had flown upon her, pressed her down, and endeavored to throttle her. Before long, she was fully possessed by an entity she called the Black One, who would take her over completely. Quote, in the midst of her work, she sees him in human form, a masculine shape in a frock, as if issuing from a dark cloud. She can never clearly describe his face, coming towards her. Then she sees him approach, always from the left side, feels as it were a cold hand which seizes the back of her neck, and in this way he enters into her. End quote. A witness described where the transformation of her personality was absolutely marvelous. I don't think they meant marvelous in a good way. William Peter Blatty used Osterreich's case studies as one of his inspirations for his 1971 novel The Exorcist. Blatty was also inspired by an article written by Bill Brinkley for the Washington Post in 1949 regarding the strange case of Ronald Edwin Hunkeler, a 14-year-old given the pseudonym of Roland Doe, who was exorcised by a group of Jesuit priests after his mother came to the Catholic Church in hopes of curing her son's aberrant behavior. The exorcism took place at the Alexian Brothers Hospital in St. Louis. Roland Doe's true identity became known in 2020 when he died at the age of 86. He retired from NASA in 2001 after working 40 years for them. He spent his entire life worrying that he would be identified as the boy who was exorcised from the devil's grip. Despite the public's, and in some instances religious clergy's belief that Satan and his demons are just metaphors for a host of sins, there are others in the Catholic Church who believe it is a force of evil bent on corrupting humans. In 2018, Pope Francis wrote, we should not think of the devil as a myth, a representation, a symbol, a figure of speech, or an idea, but rather as a personal being who assails us. Protestants and non-denominational churches believe in exorcisms. However, the Catholic Church has the longest standing tradition to address claims of demonic attack. Demonic oppression refers to spiritual influence by fallen angels over a person's thoughts, emotions, behavior, and circumstances. This can be manifested through harassment, torment, control, and illness. This condition is not possession, which is when one or more demons has control over a person's body, spirit, and mind. In the Catholic tradition, indicators for genuine demonic possession are superhuman strength, aversion to holy water, ability to speak in unknown languages, and physical strength disproportionate to age or health. The Church does have an individual undergo a psychiatric examination to rule out organic or mental health problems. Most of the claims of possession do not go beyond this stage, since the source of the problem is identified as a non-spiritual problem. This includes diagnosis of schizophrenia, psychosis, or persons who have stopped taking their psychotropic medication. There are individuals who do not welcome this answer since they are convinced they are being attacked by demons. Only a very small number of exorcism requests make it through the discernment process, which has ruled out every other explanation. During the exorcism, a priest is assisted sometimes by another priest and several lay people. Since the exorcist works with the authority of God and Jesus Christ, the demons have no choice but to obey, especially at the climax of ritual, when the priest exhorts the demon with the following command, quote, I cast you out, unclean spirit, along with every satanic power of the enemy. I respect her from hell and all your fell companions. End quote. In some cases, more than one exorcism ritual is performed until the priest is confident the demons have been completely expelled. Demons rely on doorways to invade a human being. This could be a habitual sin or family curse, in which an act of violence or iniquity committed by one generation manifests itself in subsequent generations. According to Catholic exorcists, 80% of those who come seeking an exorcism are sexual abuse survivors. The trauma creates a soul wound which makes a person more vulnerable to demons. Interest in the occult offers another doorway for demonic possession, as exemplified by the recent resurgence in witchcraft, divination, magic, and communicating with the dead via channeling. Father Gary Thomas, who was documented in the book The Rite from 2009, which was made into a movie in 2011, said, "The occult is a substitution for God. People want to take shortcuts, and the occult is all about power and knowledge." Another exorcist said the Harry Potter series disarmed Americans from thinking that all magic is darkness. At the same time, American culture has been inundated with movies, TV shows, and online games about demons and demonic possession. Carlos Eyre, a professor of history and religious studies at Yale University, said of the interest in the occult that, quote, as people's participation in Orthodox Christianity declines, there's always been a surge in interest in the occult and the demonic, end quote. It is a hunger for contact with the supernatural. In other words, the interest into dark occult material is a response to secularization. Louisa's story. Louisa Maggie Muscovitz suffered from alcohol abuse and PTSD stemming from childhood abuse. In 2016, she lived in Tacoma, Washington, and was attending weekly sessions with a counselor. When asked about her recent separation from her husband, Stephen, she underwent an alarming transformation in front of the counselor. She started to display symptoms of a panic attack, and then, with two counselors as witnesses, she started to pull her hair out, screaming, growling, and glaring. She jutted her neck out at a weird angle and muttered about God and the devil. She also referred to Louisa in the third person, saying she couldn't be saved. Louisa was known as a friendly person, and this behavior was totally unlike her. Previous to this, Louisa had told her therapist that there were times she felt as if something dark would overtake her, and the only thing to calm her was to read scripture. The therapist reminded her about this, and Louisa went through her phone until she found passages she could read. Gradually, the woman, who alternated between snarling and baring her teeth, calmed down, but this was after she vomited in a trash bin. Louisa had experienced episodes of sleep paralysis after the birth of each of her children, once in 2009 and the second time in 2013. However, in this instance, she had seen a giant spider crawling into the room. Both experiences left her profoundly disturbed. In 2011, she traveled to Kathmandu, Nepal to work on her undergraduate degree. She was planning to stay 2 months, but after 30 days, she contracted E. coli, and after spending a couple of days at the hospital, she was ready to return home, but was undecided since her return flight wasn't scheduled for another month. The apartment complex where she was staying had emptied out from students, and the streets were desolate due to political protests. That night, she secured and bolted the doors and windows and went to sleep. Hours later, she awoke suddenly to the sound of raspy breathing, so close she could feel the hot exhalation on the back of her right ear and neck. As she debated how someone could have gotten into the room, she felt a hand brush against her collarbone. This propelled her out of the sleeping bag, and she switched on the light to find she was by herself. At the same instant, stray dogs in the streets started to yelp loudly. She waited until dawn broke to trek by foot to the U.S. Embassy in Kathmandu, and she took the next flight to Orlando, Florida, where she lived then. After a second bout of sleep paralysis in 2013, she asked the psychiatrist she was seeing about the experience. The answer provided gave her no insight into the question that ran through her mind, which was whether she was going crazy. Louisa went to the internet and read up on sleep paralysis, which gave a plausible explanation for what had happened to her. However, it did not account for the experience in Nepal, which occurred when she was awake. Then she came across testimonials of people who believed they were being haunted by demons. After this, she attended Mass at St. James Cathedral and spoke to a priest to whom she retold all her experiences. The priest advised her to get rid of any occult material she had, including Ouija boards, pagan material, tarot cards, amulets, etc. Louisa followed his advice and even moved to Washington state to be closer to friends and family. In 2014, contrary to the nighttime experiences, she transformed into another person during the daytime. Her husband Stephen had witnessed these episodes about 6 times in the past 10 years. This time he started to film her with his tablet as she started to talk in a slow, measured tone while swaying back and forth and contorting her neck. She said, quote, "You humans have your own sense of time. I have plenty of time. I have all the time in the world." End quote. In a staccato whisper, she added, "It's your wife I want, not only her body, but her soul." Then she leaned forward. Then she leaned towards Stephen and whispered, "God can't save her. Do you understand that? She's mine." Then she arched her spine and her face contorted. Originally, Stephen believed these episodes were due to psychiatric problems. But then, weird things started to happen around their home. Electronics and lights would turn on and off with no one around them. Louisa also transformed when she was visiting a university friend and again spoke of wanting to hurt Louisa. This episode profoundly scared her friend. By 2016, she reached out to Father White, a Catholic exorcist who worked in the Seattle area. During their first session in 2017, he asked her to retell her experiences. When he gave her a sheet with the prayers of renunciation to recite, she was unable to do so. Then she started to dry heave and moan that devolved into guttural babbling. Once while he was praying, she broke out into hysterical laughing. During a second session, she was able to go through the prayers, and as time passed, she progressed, leading him to believe she was suffering from demonic oppression and not possession. Louisa's parents had separated when she was 3 years old. Her mother, along with her new husband, Louisa, and an older brother, moved to Fife, Washington. She suffered sexual molestation and abuse through childhood and adolescence that left her with nightmares and PTSD. She had certain triggers like 60s music or the smell of hamburger helper, which she believed was tied into her abuser somehow. Studies have found that children who experience abuse develop dissociative disorders, even though Louisa was never diagnosed with this problem. Louisa's one-time therapist believed there was something beyond this explanation as to what was wrong with her patient. The transformation she had witnessed in her office in 2016 could not be completely explained by this diagnosis. She continued to work with Father White, and her husband only witnessed one other incident where an alternate identity took over and referred to her in the third person. This time it was to threaten her life. Louisa, her husband, and 3 children eventually moved back to Central Florida. She passed away on June 21st, 2024 at the age of 41. So what do you think? If you listen to her story, to what she described, and that other lady's description, Magdalene, which happened, that was in that book, they sound very similar as to what they were saying now. Was now, and this is the part where she's not going out there and thinking up these ideas by herself. In other words, she was in touch with mental health people, whether it was to treat her alcoholism or her recovery and the and her PTSD, and yet she had never been diagnosed with psychosis, schizophrenia, or dissociative. Because, in other words, she was around professionals. She was seeing a psychiatrist. She had seen therapists. In other words, wherever she was living at, whether it was in Washington State or in Florida, she was in touch with mental health professionals, and she's not getting a diagnosis. Plus, she's only having these episodes, like her husband had witnessed 6 of them in 10 years. In reality, that's not that many for somebody that you would say, well, this person has a mental illness, a severe mental illness like schizophrenia. But then she has these episodes where, so what is it? Was she being demonically oppressed? Had she received, was the doorway what she had experienced as a child? Who knows? But ultimately, it's very sad to find out that for unknown reasons, I don't know what the reasons, because she was still a young woman at 41, she passed away earlier this year. So, again, truth is stranger than fiction. So I will be back soon with some more eerie news as we go forward towards the end of 2024. Take care. I'll be seeing you guys soon.